Hey everybody, welcome back to another video from Northeast Christian Apologetics. My name is Simon Williams, and today we're going to be continuing along a theme that we've been exploring for the past couple of monthly videos. And the theme that we're talking about is forgiveness. This is the third video in this little series that we're doing. The first video was entitled, what was it entitled? So this is the third video in this little monthly series that we're doing, and each video has been kind of building off of each other. The first video asked the question, is death an appropriate punishment for sin? And in that video I explained why not only is death an appropriate punishment for sin, but that it is a necessary consequence of sin, that it's unavoidable. And then in the second video, we asked the question like, why does somebody have to die in order for God to forgive sins? So we went into a lot of detail about that and answered that question. And at the end of that video, I asked the question is, if God has to die to forgive sins, then why don't we have to die in order to forgive sins? But before answering that question, I thought it would be helpful and beneficial to really look into why is it that God punishes us when we refuse to forgive our fellow sinners? And in order to answer this question, we're going to be revisiting the parable that we explored in the last video. And if you haven't seen the last video, I highly recommend watching it because this video isn't going to make a lot of sense unless you watch that one. And the last video is not going to make a lot of sense unless you watch the one before it. So these three videos at least, are definitely tied together. And in order for you to understand where I'm coming from and understanding where this parable is going, you need to watch those videos. So like I said, we're going to be revisiting Jesus' parable about the unforgiving servant. I told you he packed a lot into this one. As we discussed, sin is represented by debt in this parable. In this parable, servant A owed a debt to his master, who is representing God in this parable. But servant A wasn't the only servant who owed a debt. Servant B also owed a debt. Servant B owed a debt to servant A. And this, of course, is the point of Jesus' parable. Jesus' parable is aimed at answering Peter's question, which was, Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? In the parable, servant A refuses to offer servant B the same mercy that his master had shown him. And what's even worse is that servant A didn't even entertain the request of servant B, which is going to become more important in the future. The point of the parable is to show that servant A could have shown the same mercy to servant B. And this is where it gets interesting. At least for me. This whole parable is using the creditor-debtor relationship as a metaphor for forgiving sins. The creditor forgives a debt by transferring the debt from the debtor to the creditor. The debt, as discussed, representing sin, which causes separation, which in turn causes death. Please remember this because this is important, and that's the reason why I keep bringing it up. But separation is brought about by the failure to love. This type of separation means to be separated from love and to be united with sin. And thus it also means that you're being separated from life and being united with death. How does one avoid becoming united with death? That person does it by two things. The first thing is by loving the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and by loving your neighbor as yourself. The second command is manifested in our actions towards other people. Specifically, we are expected to do unto others that which we would want done unto us. In the parable, what did servant A want? Servant A begged his master for more time so that he could pay back the debt. And in that parable, we also see that servant B also asked for more time. He begged servant A for more time so that he could also pay back the debt. But servant A refused to provide to servant B the same thing that he wanted for himself. And in doing so, he failed to love servant B. Therefore, servant A sinned against servant B. And in that way, servant A separated himself from love and united himself with death. Even though it's not clear in the parable whether or not servant B knew that he had been sinned against, when the master learned of this exchange, he took it personally. But why did the master take it personally? Because in the parable, the master represents God, and God is love. To be separated from love is to become separated from God. It is to stop being a servant of God and to become the servant of death. Servant A, by failing to love servant B, by refusing to provide servant B with that which he wanted himself, which was more time, he betrayed God. Servant A rejected his master by sinning, and he also sinned against his master by sinning against one of his servants. Servant A showed who his true master was by allowing sin to reign in his members and obeying its evil desires. So the master took action to avenge his servant, servant B, but also to avenge himself. In the last video, we talked a lot about what the symbols represent in this parable, but let's talk about the prison. What is the point of prisons? Like, what is the point of jails? The point of the prison is to limit freedom. The point of jails is to separate people. It's to separate lawbreakers from those who haven't broken the law. And as we've discussed several times, separation is death. Therefore, the prison in this parable represents the abode of death. So in the end, God hands servant A over to where he actually belongs. Servant A's actions shows who his true master was. His true master was not God, but death. So all God did was hand him over to who his true master was and where his true master lives, in the abode of death. God handed servant A over to the abode of death so that he could serve the master that he chose to serve. At this point, it should be pretty clear that this parable is directed at Christians and those who claim to be Christian. So we should be listening closely and heeding this grave warning from Jesus. So also my Heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart.